Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Hannah. And thank you to ladies and gentlemen for coming here tonight to this Intelligence Squared debate, Queen Elizabeth versus Queen Victoria, or as we're calling it backstage, the Great British Queen-Off. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here, and of course, you are very welcome. Now, tonight we're going to hear about two of the very greatest monarchs in British history, both of whom ruled for an extraordinarily long time, Elizabeth for nearly 45 years, Victoria for 63 years. They both ruled over periods of extraordinary change, renewal, and reinvention. They both gave their names to iconic eras in our national history, eras of exploration, discovery, and scientific inquiry. We still measure our own times to some extent against the yardstick of these two great rulers' reigns, and they're still towering figures. Elizabeth and Victoria projected their personalities onto the canvas of history, so it's very hard to think of the 16th or the 19th centuries without seeing them through the eyes of those two extraordinary queens. Now, they were also, and I mean this as a compliment when I echo Ken Clarke's now infamous phrase, bloody difficult women. I'm delighted that we have four very distinguished speakers and actors with us who are going to tell us, in their words and the words of the queens themselves, what Elizabeth and Victoria were all about. Now, of course, this is a debate, so my job is to try and whip up as much rancor and controversy as possible. Your job is to provide most of the democratic process and to vote. Now, you will have been polled as you entered the hall, and you'll have the chance to vote again at the end of the evening, when you've heard the arguments and seen the performances by the actors. Now, the way you can vote is using this, not this, your voting card, which you should have been given on the way in. Now, the way that you use this card is to tear it in two, down the perforated bit in the middle, and when a ballot box is brought around, you put either Elizabeth or Victoria into the box. Do not lose this card. You will lose the franchise, effectively. If you're still undecided, which I can't imagine you will be, but if you're still undecided at the end of this evening, don't tear your card in half, put the whole card into the box. Now, the advocates. Speaking tonight on Elizabeth I, we have Philippa Gregory, one of the most popular novelists writing today. She's best known for her portrayals of women in the Tudor period, and her novel, The Other Boleyn Girl, which I'm sure many of you here will have read, was made into a TV drama and a major film. Her most recent book is the #1 bestseller, Three Sisters, Three Queens, and she'll be advocating for Elizabeth I. Now, advocating for Queen Victoria, we have Daisy Goodwin, screenwriter, novelist, and as you've heard, the brains behind this operation. Now, Daisy created and wrote last year's ITV hit series Victoria, and she's currently working on the second season. She's also published Victoria, a Novel of a Young Queen, and as a TV producer, she created a number of programs, including Grand Designs, which is now in its 18th year on Channel 4. Now, to illustrate their arguments, our speakers have two wonderful actors at their disposal who will be reading extracts from the Queen's writings. So please welcome Fiona Shaw. Fiona's going to play Elizabeth I. She's a widely acclaimed actor as well as a theatre and opera director, and her roles in film have included The Black Dahlia, Mountains of the Moon, and Persuasion. In the theatre, she's perhaps best known for her powerful portrayal of Medea and Richard II. Now, playing Victoria, we have Greta Scacchi. Please welcome Greta Scacchi. Greta's film credits include Heat and Dust, White Mischief, the Browning version, Jefferson in Paris, The Player, and The Falling. She's appeared in numerous television programs, including the BBC's War and Peace last year, in which she played Countess Natalia Rostova. On the West End stage, she's appeared in The Entertainer, Deep Blue Sea, and Uncle Vanya. Please give a big hand to all 4 of our contributors this evening. Now, since I'm sitting here in the middle, I get to ask any questions I want. So, Philippa, can I ask you, when did you discover your passion for Elizabeth I?
I think, like practically everybody in the world, I came across Elizabeth at school, and I think I was immediately impressed by the story of this girl who comes from literally nowhere, from a slur of bastardy to become Queen of England. So as a young woman, she's a great role model.
Fantastic, fantastic story. Daisy, when did you discover Victoria?
Well, Victoria was all around me growing up. You know, I cycled past her on the way to school. There were statues of this sort of scowling old lady everywhere I looked. But I fell for her when I was about 19, and I was studying history. And I went to the university library, and I had to read Victoria's diaries. And I opened the diaries, and I found this entry, which I'm just going to read a tiny bit of it. It's November the 1st, 1839. It was piercingly cold, and I sat in my cape, which dearest Albert settled comfortably for me. He was so cold, dear angel, being in tight white cashmere pantaloons, nothing under them, and high boots. We cantered home again. And I just read that, and I laughed in the Cambridge University Library, which you're not meant to do. And after that, I thought, well, she's really a girl after my own heart.
Well, I'm very sorry I didn't wear tight white cashmere pantaloons this evening, Daisy. Okay, let's get going with our first piece of advocacy. Philippa, over to you. Please advocate for Elizabeth.
I kind of want to start with arguing with the title, which is what you always do. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have been at university when you'd have a discussion and somebody sooner or later would say, define, define. And you would go, that's got me stuck. So I think we shouldn't compare successful women, because I don't think we have so many that we can afford to set them up to like wrestle in jelly. However, since that is what we are doing, we're going to do, I think, a celebration of these 2 great women, and it may be that at the end of it you prefer Elizabeth, so be it. Elizabeth was an absolutely fantastic queen, and one of the reasons for this is because she was innately a great woman. She is an excellent role model for women. She was sexually active. She was shameless. She was willful. She was dominant. She was dishonest. She was pragmatic. And also, she was a great queen because she was unflinching and transparent in her despotism. She's an old-school queen. She's an old-school monarch. She's not one of these nimby-pimby, we have a lovely family, we're your friends, we'll come and open your factory sort of queen. She's a queen who gets out there and says, I am Queen of England, it's going to be like this, and if you don't like it, I'm going to behead you. And if you're going to have a monarchy, and I don't think you should have one at all, but if you're going to have a monarchy, for God's sake, have a woman who's going to do something effective and not just discuss things with people, or worse still, be devoted to her husband and family. As an heir, she was a really terrible, treasonous heir. She was the most unreliable, rebellious, difficult woman that you would ever hate to have snapping at your heels. She was involved in 2 major conspiracies, causing the death of 5 conspirators. She undermined her sister, the absolutely miserably unhappy Mary Tudor, who I'm sure would have been not nearly so unhappy if she hadn't had Elizabeth flaunting around the court and flirting with her husband. She pretended to be Catholic, so effectively that everybody thought she was Catholic, except she kept being carried out of church with stomachache. She insisted upon wearing black and white so that she looked A, absolutely fabulous, and B, she could be pretending to be eschewing vanity. She always cleverly concealed all of her positions, even in the state, even when she was writing a poem scratched on the windows of Woodstock Palace while under house arrest. Even that poem can be read as a boast that she cannot be convicted, or a ringing declaration of independence.
Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be. quoth Elizabeth, the prisoner.
Of course, this had an effect when she came to the throne. All Tudors suspected and feared their heirs, all had good reason. Only Elizabeth persecuted her heirs because she knew how treasonous and dangerous an heir can be, with the result that she refused to name her heir until the very last minute, until she was dying. This is what she said when she was asked to sign a device to promise the succession to Mary, Queen of Scots.
Ye think that this device of yours should make friendship between us? And I fear that rather it should produce the contrary effect. Think you that I could love my winding sheet? Princes cannot like their own children, those that should succeed unto them. How shall I, think you, like my cousin, being once declared my heir apparent, I know the inconsistency of the people of England, how they ever mislike the present government and has their eyes fixed upon the person that is next to succeed. More do adore the rising than the setting sun. I have good experience myself in my sister's time, how desirous men were that I should be in place and earnest to set me up. And if I would have consented, I know what enterprises would have been attempted to bring me to pass.
I love this. It challenges, first of all, the oppressive lie which has held women down for centuries, the powerful fiction of maternal love. Princes cannot like, she doesn't even say love, princes cannot like their own children. She doesn't fudge it by saying that they love them, but they cannot like them, or that they love them, but their behavior is sometimes troubling. She says they can't like them, and in that she sets all of us free. Elizabeth, as a woman, might have been expected to have maternal feelings, but bang, she's a monarch. She's a prince, as she calls it, claiming to be an honorary male, and so womanly tenderness does not apply. And if womanly tenderness does not apply to Elizabeth, it doesn't need to apply to any of us. At once, we have this get-out for women, and it's from Elizabeth I, a great role model. Not every woman loves children. This is a liberating vision. It is possible. Elizabeth tells us so. You, yourself, might not be naturally disposed to having children. Elizabeth states it simply. It's an option. Indeed, femininity itself and all the disadvantages that come with confining yourself to a stereotype ideal of womanhood, that's optional too. According to Elizabeth, she refers to herself as a man when she wants to emphasize her authority and power. On the brink of the invasion by the Spanish Armada by 1558, she rode down to Tilbury.
My loving people, I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live and to die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body, but of a weak and feeble woman. But I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field.
I say this is going awfully well. I like that bit. As a military leader, Elizabeth naturally adopted the rhetoric of a commander. But as a political leader, she was, like all Tudors, like all kings, veering constantly towards the tyrannical. There was no pretext of democracy or interest in the will of the people. Monarchs are, by their very nature, despots. If you want a democratic monarchy, you have to tie them up in 100 pieces of legislation. Elizabeth believed, as perhaps some of you may now be thinking, that the will of the people is best left to the people, not consulted, and that the leaders had better well get on and lead. That's what Elizabeth thought, and she shows us that monarchy is tyranny. She said this to Parliament:
"My lords, do whatever you wish. As for me, I shall do no otherwise than pleases me."
Elizabeth was in no way a supporter of women's rights. She wasn't much of a supporter of anyone's rights but her own. But she was surrounded all her life by her inner court of ladies, and they were intimate and loving friends. I have to admit there were incidents. There was a broken finger, there were some things broken, there were some hair pullings, there were some scoldings, there was a few bannings from court. Robert Dudley's first wife was murdered at the height of Robert and Elizabeth's love affair, and his second wife was banned from court forever. Elizabeth was a terrible rival and a demanding employer, but a loyal and good friend to the women that she loved. She had been tenderly raised by Lady Bryant, and she loved her governess, Cat Ashley, till the end of her life. She even risked writing in defense of her governess when Cat was arrested, suspected of treason.
"She hath been with me a long time, and many years, and hath taken great labour and pain in bringing me up in learning and honesty, and therefore I ought of very duty to speak for her. For St. Gregory saith that we are more bound to them that bringeth us up well than to our parents. For our parents do that which is natural for them, that is, bringeth us into the world. But our bringers up are the cause to make us live well in it."
Elizabeth was ambivalent about her sex, and that isn't surprising when you consider that she saw 4 stepmothers abused by her father and one of them executed. Her own mother, of course, was executed by her father, so it's not too Freudian to suggest that she associated men with power and women with dangerous vulnerability. In that, she follows contemporary thought, which called women rulers princes to distinguish them from the usually powerless daughters or wives of kings. It happened that Elizabeth's reign coincided with some other powerful rulers, actually only 3 others, but that was enough for John Knox to detect a monstrous regiment. Most writers at the time struggled with the concept of someone being both a woman and a ruler. Elizabeth identified herself as different from conventional women.
"Though the sex to which I belong is considered weak, you will nevertheless find me a rock that bends to no wind."
She gained the throne by inheritance from her father, and she constantly referenced herself to his power.
"I may not be a lion, but I am a lion's cub, and I have a lion's heart."
She was not a feminist in the sense that she supported women as a whole. Like some women later come to power, she had all the contempt of the powerful for the powerless, which led her to denigrate women and to separate herself from them.
"I have the heart of a man, not a woman, and I am not afraid of anything."
And though her last stepmother was a published author and scholar, and Elizabeth admired her deeply, studied with her, and was proud of her fluency in languages, she was still happy to echo the old misogynist chorus about women's learning.
"There is no marvel in a woman learning to speak, but there would be in teaching her to hold her tongue."
Thank you. As a learned queen who loved languages, she encouraged the education of young women and was part of a poetry writing, religious writing, and publishing generation of women. The Renaissance peaked in England under Elizabeth, and women artists and musicians created their works and received royal patronage. More than 100 women writers published during Elizabeth's reign, compared with a handful under her predecessors. But though she was surrounded by women poets as her ladies-in-waiting, Mary Sidney, Jane Seymour, there's no indication that she ever demonstrated anything like positive discrimination for women in the arts. For Elizabeth herself, her greatest work was always her own image. Think of the magnificent portraits filled with symbolism. Think of her revaluing the coinage and putting her image on it. Think of the magnificent court progresses when she made her courtiers bankrupt themselves to host her all around the countryside and so publicize the Elizabeth brand. She was a conscious and powerful creator of the royal image. Her greatest impact is in her creation of herself. She gives us a fantastic model of what a woman can do if no one can stop her. And making sure that no one could stop her was one of the great victories of her life. Of course she couldn't marry. Medieval and church law ruled that a woman was the servant of her husband, and Elizabeth had seen how that worked out for her sister Mary or for all her father's wives. To remain in full power on the throne, to control her own life, Elizabeth could never marry, and the many courtships were diplomatic negotiations, never a wavering of that determination.
In the end, this shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin.
But because we have been so convinced by the later so-called Victorian concept of repressed sexuality, we confuse Elizabeth's virginity with personal chastity or even with frigidity. This is not Elizabethan. Virginity was part of the brand, what people could now call outward facing. She would declare herself married to her people, but she remained sexually promiscuous and flirtatious. Elizabeth declared herself to be a virgin publicly and repeatedly, but absolutely refused to hide her sexual activity or her passionate love affairs. Even when the affair with Robert Dudley was a public scandal, she still gave him a bedroom that connected with hers and spent days and nights in his company. She ruled her courtiers by sexual flirtation, and she insisted on elaborate compliments and sexual grooming. She was hugely vain, asking the Scots ambassador whether she was more beautiful than the famously lovely Mary, Queen of Scots. And when he fudged the answer by saying Mary was taller than Elizabeth, she said, "Then she must be too tall, because I am neither too tall nor too short." We cannot know how deep her feelings went for the many men that she encouraged to say that they loved her. Certainly, she was passionately in love with Robert Dudley, probably with Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, and certainly with Francois, Duke of Alençon. She wrote this poem for him when he left in 1582, showing herself as a woman capable of both love and poetry.
My care is like my shadow in the sun. Follows me flying when I pursue it, stand and lies by me, doth what I have done. His too familiar care doth make me rue it. No means I find to rid him from my breast, till the end of things it be suppressed. Some gentler passions slide into my mind, for I am soft and made of melting snow. Or be more cruel, love, and so be kind. Let me float or sink, be high or low. Let me live with some more sweet content, or die, and so forget what love e'er meant.
Famously tolerant on religion, when she came to the throne following her half-sister, who had persecuted people for their beliefs, Elizabeth said,
I have no desire to make windows into men's souls.
She was convinced she had to persecute Roman Catholics when the Pope declared against her, when she was posed with the problem of Roman Catholic heir in Mary, Queen of Scots, and the religion became associated with treason to the throne. As she said of her enemies, arrested Roman Catholics.
Those who appear the most sanctified are the worst.
Elizabeth was a pragmatist on matters of religion. She didn't have her parents' interest in theology. As she said,
there is only one Christ, Jesus, one faith. All else is a dispute over trifles.
And in another little poem, scratched by her on the window at Woodstock, perhaps truly describes her authentic belief and her lack of interest in theological arguments.
Christ was the word that spake it. He took the bread and brake it, and what his words did make it, that I believe and take it.
Any judgment of Elizabeth has to give her all the credit in the world for the fact that she was the most tremendous, barefaced liar. She really never troubled herself with the truth, and words to her were a currency. It was for her to value them and pass them off where she needed. She was terrified to order the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, for plotting against her, and she asked Mary's gaoler, Amos Paulet, if he would shorten her life. When he refused, quite horrified, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, but after the execution said that she had not intended it to take effect. She arrested the Privy Councillor responsible, and she herself collapsed into grief or perhaps guilt. And she wrote this to Mary's son and cousin and her own heir.
My dear brother, I would you knew, though not felt, the extreme dolour that overwhelms my mind for that miserable accident, which, far contrary to my meaning, hath befallen. I have now sent this kinsman of mine to instruct you truly of that which is too irksome for my pen to tell you. I beseech you that as God and many more know how innocent I am in this case, so you will believe me that if I had bid aught, I would have bid by it. I am not so base-minded that fear of any living creature or prince should make me so afraid to do that were just, or done to deny the same. I am not of so base a lineage, nor carry so vile a mind. But as to disguise fits not a king, so will I never dissemble my actions, but cause them to show even as I meant them, thus assuring yourself of me, that as I know this was deserved, yet if I had meant it, I would never lay it on others' shoulders, no more will I not damnify myself that thought it not to do it.
Convincing. Elizabeth was a great queen in that she was a great model for female behavior, sexually active, never promising obedience to a man, unafraid to show her aggression, militancy, and dominance. She loved and promoted women around her. She was a model of women's education, which did much to contribute to the Golden Age. She encouraged the English Renaissance and encouraged its spread to women writers. We partly see the impact of her as a cultured, dominant woman in the backlash of misogyny when James took the throne. She was a great queen for England, passing laws to protect the poor, supporting the navy, and thus expanding England overseas, if you like that sort of thing. She maintained the tyrannical power of the throne, and what else should a king do? She restored the values of the currency, maintaining peace for the kingdom while exporting piracy and slavery, if you like that sort of thing. And people did then. And ruling for a long time to give a period of stability and certainty. To be a medieval monarch is not to be a modern monarch. It is to be a tyrant ruling by fear and favor. And she did that more successfully than many of her predecessors, and far more successfully than any of her successors. She herself said that nobody, and that would include Victoria, would be ever better than her. It is Elizabeth herself who, considering all the evidence and with the approach to the truth and accuracy that is the hallmark of Elizabeth I, tells you today, here and now, that she is the best queen. Oh, no, these are her very words.
There will never queen sit in my seat with more zeal to my country, care to my subjects, and that will sooner with willingness venture her life for your good and safety than myself. For it is my desire to live nor reign no longer than my life and reign shall be for your good. And though you have had and may have many princes more mighty and wise sitting in this seat, yet you never had nor shall have any that will be more careful and loving.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Daisy Goodwin and Greta Scacchi.
I think that Mrs. Thatcher might have enjoyed Philippa's spirited defense of female tyranny. But I'm going to talk about a different queen. When I first fell in love with Victoria all those years ago in the university library, it wasn't a queen who spoke to me. It was a woman. There was something hugely appealing about this tiny girl with her keen eye for the male form. But 30 years later, the thing I really admire about her is the way in which the sassy teenager grew up into an international matriarch without ever losing her sense of self. Unlike Elizabeth, who was either pretending to be a man or playing the coquette in order to get what she wanted, Victoria was always and magnificently her own woman. Victoria had to use a modern term, and it's interesting that Philippa used it too. She had a very keen sense of her own brand. At the age of 4, she told her mother that she wasn't going to speak German at home, and that's because she knew even then that it wasn't such a good idea for an English princess to have a German accent. That may still be true, I don't know. When she came to the throne, she rejected the names by which queens had been known up till then. So, there's a tradition that you style yourself as something. And she was called Alexandrina Victoria. She was always called Alexandrina at home. And they said, well, perhaps you should be called Elizabeth, ma'am, or Anne, or Mary, or one of these traditional names. And she said, no way, I'm going to be called Victoria. And they went, Victoria? Victoria was a made-up name. It was like calling yourself Queen Beyoncé. It was the Anglicization of her mother's second name, Victoire. So there were no Victorias in the country. So there was a country who, first of all, had to deal with the fact that they were having to say, God save the Queen, after 200 years of saying, God save the King. And they were having to call her by this outlandish name, Queen Victoria. But the tiny teenage queen knew what she was about. And I think that she deliberately chose a name that was about winning, victory. Historians can argue about how much power Victoria actually wielded, but no one can deny that in this one crucial respect, she molded the 19th century in her own image. This woman came to the throne in the era of candles and carriages, but when she died, footage of her funeral was shown in cinemas. And when she died, in 1901, there was probably no more famous face in the world than this old lady in black. Elizabeth may have been a genius, I think she probably was, but despite the many books and films that have been made about her, she's still essentially a distant figure. We don't really know who she is, but that's emphatically not the case with Victoria, who kept diaries all her life. Someone has calculated that she wrote 62 million words in her lifetime. No other monarch has been such an indefatigable recorder of her own life, as entertaining or as vivid. So here she is, talking about a trip she made through the coalfields in the Midlands when she was only 14.
The men, women, and children, country and houses are all black. The grass is quite blasted and black. Just now I saw an extraordinary building flaming with fire. The country continues, black, engine flaming, coals in abundance, everywhere smoking and burning coal heaps, intermingled with wretched huts and carts and little ragged children.
if she hadn't been queen, she might have been a very good reporter. And of course, she was the first monarch to write an international bestseller, which Leaves from Our Life in the Highlands. As you read her early diaries, you get a sense of a girl who's intensely curious about the world, a world she's not allowed to see by her overprotective mother, the Duchess of Kent. She's a girl growing up completely controlled by her mother and her mother's advisor slash boyfriend slash lover, John Conroy, because her father, the Duke of Kent, the George III's fourth son, had died when she was only 8 months old. So the young Alexandrina, as she was known then, never had a moment to herself. She has no friends of her own. She's not allowed to sleep on her own. She has to sleep in a camp bed in her mother's bedroom. She's not even allowed to walk downstairs on her own without holding her governess's hand in case she falls down and breaks her neck, because her mother and Conroy are so desperate to protect their investment because they're hoping that she's going to become queen before she's 18 and so that they can rule the country through her. So her childhood was absolutely stifling. They wanted complete control over her mind and her body. It might have broken a lesser girl, but the tiny queen, and she was only 4'11", the day she becomes queen, she didn't suffer from any vestige of Stockholm syndrome. The day she becomes queen, the first thing she says is, "I want to be alone." And that's the first time ever that she'd been alone in her life. And I find that very moving, that she's been waiting all that time, and then the moment she becomes queen, she declares herself she's going to be independent. But despite this difficult childhood, and unlike Elizabeth, Victoria is not afraid of love, far from it. The first thing she does, the first man she's alone with, in fact, is the charming and elegant Lord Melbourne, who, although 50-something, was still one of the most beguiling men in Europe. And he was the first man she'd ever met who treated her not as an opportunity, but as a woman. And it's very charming when you read her early diaries. She's like Boswell, an eager Boswell to his Johnson. She writes everything down that he says as if she's trying to kind of bottle him, the essence of him.
1st of July, 1837. Talked with Lord M about many important things. He is indeed a truly honest, straightforward, and noble-minded man, a man in whom I can safely place confidence. There are not many like him in this world of deceit. Saturday, 19th of May, 1838. I said I often stood before a person not knowing what to say. And Lord M said, the longer one thought about it, the worse it was. And really, the best thing was to say anything foolish rather than to say nothing at all. I said to Lord M, I was afraid he disliked the Germans, as he was always laughing at them. He said, I've a great opinion of their talents, but not of their beauty. Tuesday, the 28th of August. Lord M said it was such a difficult thing, the marriage of a monarch. Marrying a subject was inconvenient, and there was inconvenience in marrying foreigners. Lord M again took 2 apples, but only ate one, and put the other before him. I asked him if he meant to eat it. He thought not, and said, but I like to have the power of doing so. I observed, hadn't he just as well the power of doing so when the apples were in the dish on the table? He laughed and said, not the full power. I sent for Dashie, who Lord M accused of having crooked legs, which I wouldn't allow. We put him on the table, and he was very much petted and patted and admired by Lord M, who was so funny about him. We gave him tea, and Lord M said, I wonder if lapping is a pleasant sensation, for that it was a thing we never had felt.
Of course, Elizabeth may have hung on to power by not getting married, but I think for today's women, Victoria makes a more interesting choice. 5 days after meeting her cousin Albert for the second time, the first time she thought he was a bit of a wuss because he liked to go to bed early. She proposed to him. This isn't the blushing heroine of a Victorian novel at all, waiting for Mr. Right to pop the question, but a woman who sees a man in white cashmere breeches with nothing on underneath and snaps him up.
3rd of November, 1839. At 20 minutes past 6, my precious Albert came to me and stayed with me until 12 minutes past 7. We stood by the fire together. Then he took me around the waist and looked down on me so dearly, so kindly, and clasped me in his arms and kissed me. And we sat on the sofa together, and I leant on him, and he his head on me. And he took my hands in his and said my hands were so little. He could hardly believe they were hands, as he had hitherto only been accustomed to handle hands like Ernest's.
Ernest was his brother, I just hasten to add. It's the ultimate irony, of course, that the woman who gave her name to a century of prudishness was a deeply passionate person who enjoyed sex with her husband very much, as she wrote about on her wedding night.
We had dinner in our sitting room, but I had such a sick headache that I could eat nothing and was obliged to lie down in the middle blue room for the remainder of the evening on the sofa. But ill or not, I never spent such an evening. My dearest, dear Albert sat on a footstool by my side, and his excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before. He clasped me in his arms, and we kissed each other again and again. Oh, this was the happiest day of my life.
So this wasn't a Victorian matron who lay back and thought of England, not at all. Some of the crossest entries in her diaries refer to the nights where, for some reason or another, Victoria and Albert had no fun. It was the great tragedy of this sensual woman's life that she had no access to contraception, and so she was forced to endure what she called the shadow side of marriage, i.e. childbirth, no less than 9 times. And I think it's very funny that after her 8th child, her 9th child, Dr. Reed said to her, you know, ma'am, maybe you should not have any more children. It might be dangerous. She said, oh, doctor, no more fun in bed. As for Albert, I think he was almost as keen as his wife. You know, so when they built Osborne House, their holiday home, he installed a special device so that when they got into bed and they felt amorous, he could press a button which would lock the door. So he could lock the door without getting out of bed, which I thought was thought of everything. Like Elizabeth, Victoria's not what we would call a feminist. She didn't really understand why women would want votes, although her daughters were feminists. But then if you're the Queen, it might be hard to understand what it is like not to have power. But in practical terms, she did more than any other monarch to improve the lot of women. And this is one of the reasons. In 1854, she became the first woman, the distinguished woman, to use pain relief during the birth of her 8th child, Leopold.
That blessed chloroform, soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure.
And it sounds like a no-brainer, but at the time it was a very controversial decision because there were lots of clergymen about who thought that labour pains were God's punishment for Eve's original sin. And in order to use the chloroform, Victoria had to get permission from the Archbishop of Canterbury. But once that had been done, anaesthetic became widespread, and so every woman in this room really should be grateful to her. During the 21 years of their marriage to Albert, Victoria had to sort out that very modern dilemma of how do you make a relationship work when you're the breadwinner, the woman, so to speak. It's probably helped that she was pregnant so often, which meant that Albert got to share the responsibility a bit. But there's no doubt that it worked. Whatever they were doing, it worked. Their marriage was unprecedentedly happy by royal standards. Not that they're terribly high, but there was no whisper of infidelity. After a succession of debauched old men with their mistresses and scandals that had preceded her, Victoria and Albert, with their brood of children, were the model of bourgeois virtue. And although they lived in palaces, Victoria and Albert were the first royals to appear to be just like us. As the great Victorian political philosopher Walter Bagehot said,
"A family on the throne is an interesting idea. It brings down the pride of sovereignty to the level of petty life."
It's a straight line, I think, from the first photographs of Albert and Victoria, where they had to hold their heads in neck vices so they didn't move, to Elizabeth and Philip barbecuing sausages on that Scottish beach in the Royal Family documentary in the 60s. It's a measure of how successful Victoria was in restoring the popularity of the British monarchy at the beginning of her reign, which started in 1837, that in 1848, when revolution was sweeping Europe and monarchies were being toppled left, right, and centre, Victoria remained firmly on her throne. There was a great social movement, the Chartism, which wanted equal suffrage and even votes for women, but it never really got anywhere. It ended in a sort of downpour on Kennington Common. And what was interesting, that they didn't call for a republic, they just wanted to talk directly to their queen. The only time when the monarchy looked a bit shaky during Victoria's reign was when Victoria withdrew from public life in the few years after Albert died. But then, the Prince of Wales almost dies of typhus, and Victoria is persuaded to come back out into public to go to a Thanksgiving service. And from that moment on, she couldn't believe how many people there were cheering her on, and they cheered her on for the rest of her reign, another 30 years. Of course, Victoria didn't have the power that Elizabeth did. She couldn't, for example, cut off the head of her great enemy, William Gladstone, although I think there were times when she might have wanted to.
On Thursday, the day these horrible new people came, there was a terrible thunderstorm in which they left. You say that Mr. Gladstone is very loyal towards me, and so, in a certain way, he is. But it is idle to attempt to have any influence with him. He listens to no one and won't hear any contradiction in discussion. He really is half crazy, half silly, and it's better not to provoke discussion. But it is awful to have such a man at the head. Please God, he will give it up soon.
But while she didn't lead her troops into battle, I think Victoria wielded what today we would call soft power. With Victoria, the personal was always political, and she used her own children to create, I guess, a prototype for the EU, marrying them into royal families all around Europe, hoping that her children would instill liberal British values into the more authoritarian courts of Europe, Germany in particular. When Bismarck met her, when she went to Berlin, Bismarck was really, really nervous about meeting her, and he was just like sort of shaking, and he went in, and Victoria sailed out, and she was, it went terribly well, and Bismarck came out, and he went, oh my God, what a woman. She was a woman I could do business with. So I think, and he was the Iron Chancellor, so I think that says something about her magnificence. I think if our two queens had voted in the recent referendum, Elizabeth, with her distrust of the continent, particularly Spain, would have been for Brexit. But Victoria, who saw herself as the head of her own European Union, was clearly a Remainer. And I have to say, I don't think she would have been amused by the result. When it comes to the rest of the world, Victoria believed that Britain had great responsibilities, and she never hesitated to remind her ministers of that.
If we are to maintain our position as a first-rate power, and no one but people like the radicals can doubt it, we must, with our Indian empire and large colonies, be prepared for attacks and wars somewhere or other, continually. And the true economy will be to be always prepared.
And then this is a quote when she's writing to Disraeli about her foreign policy.
Oh, if the Queen were a man, she would like to go and give those horrid Russians, whose word one cannot trust, such a beating.
And when her secretary remonstrated with her about writing directly to the Tsar, who was, after all, her son Alfred's father-in-law, she said,
"It is a miserable thing to be a constitutional queen and to be unable to do what is right."
On the other hand, she did knit socks for the soldiers in the Crimea, which is something I don't think Elizabeth I would have done. When it came to domestic policy, Victoria was indefatigable. Nothing escaped her eagle eye. I particularly like this bit when, in the 1880s, when Whitechapel was being terrorized by the awful crimes of Jack the Ripper, and bodies were being found all over Whitechapel. Victoria took time out to write to the hopeless Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, with her thoughts on how the investigation might be better conducted.
Have the cattle boats and passenger boats been examined? Has any investigation been made as to the number of single men occupying rooms to themselves? The murderer's clothes must be saturated with blood and must be kept somewhere. Is there sufficient surveillance at night? These are some of the questions that occur to the Queen on reading the accounts of this horrible crime.
I think Queen Victoria, the crime fighter, might be a whole new direction for a TV series. And when it comes to the British Empire, we can't obviously shy away from some of the atrocities committed in the name of imperialism. But I think one of the most interesting things about Victoria from a modern viewpoint is that while she may have been the mother of empire, personally, she was completely without class or colour prejudice. I mean, look at the men that she fancied after Albert's death. John Brown, a Scottish alcoholic, Benjamin Disraeli, a gay Sephardic Jew, and lastly, Abdul Karim, her Muslim Indian servant. You know, to call someone Victorian is to imply that they are conventional and hidebound by stereotype, but Victoria was anything but. So when the Munshi, her tutor, as she called him, was accused of stealing by her courtiers, who absolutely loathed him, Victoria went on the attack at their snobbish racism in this blistering letter.
To make out the poor, good Munshi is low is outrageous, and in a country like England, quite out of place. She has known 2 archbishops who were sons, respectively, of a butcher and a grocer, a chancellor whose father was a poor sort of Scotch minister, Sir D. Stewart and Lord Mount Stephen, both who ran about barefoot as children. And the tradesmen, Maple and Price, were made baronets. Abdul's father saw good and honourable service as a doctor, and he feels cut to the heart at being spoken thus of. The Queen is so sorry for the poor Munshi's sensitive feelings.
There is another thing that's attractive about Victoria, and this is in contrast to Elizabeth, is that she wasn't personally vain. I mean, she was concerned about her image, you know, on coins and stamps and so forth. And she loved beauty in others, but she never fussed about her own appearance. I love the shocked tone of one of the French observers of her arrival in France. And they go, "Oh, la reine anglaise." And then she's carrying this, they couldn't understand why she was carrying this large white handbag on which was embroidered a golden poodle. And the answer was that it had been made for her by one of her daughters, and she was going to take it everywhere she went. So I find that rather charming. At her Golden Jubilee in 1887, her Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, begged her to wear a crown when she went on a procession around London, but she absolutely refused. She said, "My people know I'm a poor widow woman, and I'm going to wear my widow's cap," and that's what she did. So while Elizabeth was a remote and awesome figure, Victoria made a great play of being an ordinary woman. She understood better than anyone that that's what connected her to the people. And One of the things I think is also interesting about her was that she was totally up to date with technology. So she embraced photography. You know, the moment it came out, Albert and she got photographed at once. They were patrons of the Royal Photography Society, and she was the first woman in Britain to use the telephone in 1878 and had one immediately installed in Osborne House. And I think today she would have loved Twitter, although... you know, maybe not. One of the things I loved about putting Victoria on ITV is how much a young female audience have come to enjoy her story. Of course, they like the frocks and the men in uniform, but I think the real attraction for them is the spectacle of a young woman in power who isn't afraid to assert herself against a forest of older, taller men. Of course, she doesn't always behave well. Her behaviour during the bedchamber crisis, where she made it impossible for Sir Robert Peel to form a government because she wanted to keep Lord Melbourne in power, was, you know, unconstitutional to say the least. But you can't help admiring her for trying to get what she wanted, which is to have Lord Melbourne continue to be her Prime Minister. She may not have faced down an armada, but she stood up to the patriarchy, all right. I suppose the really interesting thing about this debate is that Elizabeth and Victoria are both great monarchs, clearly, and interestingly, more interesting than their male equivalents. I doubt if so many of you would have turned up to a debate about George III versus George V. There's a fascination, isn't there, about women in power. Even today, look at all the fuss about Theresa May's leather trousers. So when you come to vote, you have to ask yourself, not which woman do you like best, but what are queens for? I have to say that although 10 years ago I might have been more of a Republican, today a constitutional monarch seems even more like a bulwark of stability in an age of unbridled democracy. I quite like having a head of state who knows what they're doing. Elizabeth, I have to say, was the eager maniacal CEO who dodged the issue of succession planning. Victoria, on the other hand, filled a nursery with potential CEOs. When she died in 1901, she was universally acknowledged to be the most popular monarch we've ever had. Is it better to be feared or loved? I know which I would choose. So I admire Elizabeth I for her courage and her undoubted political skills, but I think she survived by shutting down great parts of herself. If you think that being a great woman means acting like a man, and actually sometimes looking like a man in drag, then by all means vote for Elizabeth. But if you believe that a woman can be powerful and also have it all, then I urge you to vote for Victoria.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard two very persuasive arguments. We have, on the one hand, Victoria, the bulwark of stability, and on the other hand, Elizabeth, I was going to say a necessary despot, but now I've got this image of a man in drag. That was not fair, Daisy. Right. When you came in, you were all polled on who you thought was the greater, Queen Elizabeth or Victoria. Who would like to know what you thought? Right, yes. Yes is the answer. You have to say yes. Okay, the original polling when we came in was Queen Elizabeth I is the greatest monarch. 53% of you thought Queen Elizabeth I was the greatest monarch. 24% of you thought that Queen Victoria was the greatest monarch. But that leaves 23% undecided. So there is still everything to play for, or 23% to play for in any case. We're going to start a Q&A now, and I have one big thing to ask everybody in the room during this Q&A, and that is Q means Q. Please ask a question and don't stand up and grandstand when they give you the microphone. Now, that said, we're going to be bringing microphones around. I'm going to take questions in batches of 3, and then we're going to put them to the speakers. So it'd be helpful if when you ask your question, if you can stand up, say your name, say what your question is, and I will do all the rest. While we get the microphones round, in fact, can we have a show of hands who would like to ask a question while I rabbit on for a bit? We have one at the front, yes, a lady down here, and I can see somebody at the back there. I can just see a hand, and I think a ponytail, so yes, over here. While we get the microphones out, Philippa, can I ask you a question? Queen Elizabeth, all this virgin queen stuff, isn't it just the sort of fake news of the 16th century? You know, this like a great big con which really dodged the issue and left England in a complete mess in 1603.
No, she didn't leave England in a complete mess because it was clear to everybody that her cousin James I of Scotland would inherit, and by beheading his mother, she had made sure that there wouldn't be a Catholic heir to the throne, which, if you're in favour of a Protestant settlement, which Victoria certainly would have been, was a good job well done. In terms of her virginity, it was a political decision. It isn't a private decision. She has to find some way to resolve the problem of the fact that she simply cannot marry without giving up power, and in a way to sell that to people. And what she comes up with is this genius method of telling the country that she is stayed a virgin for them. So then she actually gets the gratitude for it, as well as the most sensible thing to do under the circumstances. Also, you know, Elizabeth would probably not have survived 8 childbirths. She certainly had a very bad family history of fertility. And, you know, Victoria may have undertaken it with whatever joy that she managed to find before chloroform. There was no chloroform for Elizabeth, and there was no even hygiene. So it was incredibly dangerous to go into childbirth as a medieval woman. She really couldn't risk it.
Thank you very much. Right, are we ready with some questions? I've got a question for you, but I'm going to wait. Right, number 1. Please, if you stand up and...
Hi, thanks for the talk, or talks. I hope to ask, so our Queen now, Elizabeth II, has to welcome a strange guest later this year, an orange guy from America, and I wondered if there are any examples of our other great queens welcoming kind of unwanted guests, and how did they both deal with it? Thank you.
Okay, do we have an equivalent for Donald Trump? Okay. Second question just over here.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I was just wondering, for both sides, if you had to put forward only one of the points that you've put forward today and use that as your representation, which point would you prefer to put forwards? Thank you.
What's the single point? Okay, lovely. And where was the third question? Just here, yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, do you think that Queen Elizabeth, obviously they were both very successful in their own reigns, do you believe that with their such different personalities, if they would have done so well in sort of opposite reigns, so Queen Elizabeth in the Victorian era and Queen Victoria in the Elizabethan era? Thank you.
Could they have swapped places? Well, let's start with the big one, the orange elephant in the room. Daisy, how would Queen Victoria have dealt with Donald Trump?
I think she would have given him her famous scowl, actually.
Yes.
I think she would have, if she could terrify Bismarck, I think she could handle Trump. No problem at all, actually.
She wouldn't have helped him down the step.
I think not. I think she might have pushed him down. No, I think she I think she would have found him absolutely astonishing, and she would have given him short shrift, because she was very good at shutting down any kind of lèse majesté, and if he'd touched her, I think she would have had the household cavalry onto him in seconds. Don't you think?
Should have blocked him on Twitter.
Yeah, definitely.
Off with his head?
Well, when she got very bored of Eric of Sweden when he came over courting, and she let him stay while he bought her fantastic presents. And then when he stopped providing these beautiful gifts, he had this beautiful diamond heart pierced with, and all his servants were in liveries with this diamond heart pierced with an arrow. And she enjoyed that for a good while, and when she got fed up with it, she just didn't see him. She just shut the doors and said, you know, you might as well go, show's over. And, you know, we could maybe start with that with Trump.
Daisy, do you think Victoria and Elizabeth could have traded places? How would Victoria have got on the 16th century?
I think she would have found it within herself to cut people's heads off if she'd really had to. But I also think she would have found a way to have children. I think, well, not, she didn't particularly want to have children, but I think she would have found a way to have sex. So, because she definitely enjoyed all of that. But I think, you know, I think it's a non-historical question because they are both clearly women of their times. I mean, you can't really transpose them because they've both been brought up in completely different ways. So I think it would be difficult really to answer that question. I think Elizabeth would have been quite an interesting queen in the 19th century, definitely.
Yes, what do you think, Philippa? Could Elizabeth have gone to the 19th century and not chopped people's heads off?
Oh yes, I mean I think what you see in Elizabeth's career is her extraordinary political ability to really manage the message depending on who she wanted to speak to. So for instance, she's incredibly pleasant and encouraging to any of the Spanish ambassadors and sends messages to the King of Spain when she's completely committed to building a navy because she knows they're going to invade sooner or later. I mean, she's very, very good at diplomacy. So I think she'd have taken to, you know, the exchange of letters and papers like a duck to water. I think she'd been very happy with that. I think the respectability and the bourgeois nature of Victorian family life would have just killed her. I think what she'd have done is she'd have kept up a good veneer of it, but by God, you wouldn't have wanted to be Albert and marry Elizabeth.
But I think you could also say that Victoria got up to more than, you know, her image has been very carefully managed.
Yes.
So I think that post-Albert, there was a lot more going on than we think.
Well. I scarcely know what to say. I'm going to save the question about your best point because we're going to sum up at the end. So, any more questions? We've got a young lady I think over there. That'll do. And who here? Oh, yes. And how about? Yeah. Let's have the first question.
Hi, thank you so much for tonight. My question is, to what extent was each Queen's power limited by Parliament, and do you believe that they could have achieved other things without that restraint? Thank you.
Good question, nice and pithy. Thank you for listening to the instructions.
First of all, thank
Number
you
two.
so much for your talk. So obviously here we're talking about two incredible British queens, but how do you think that Elizabeth and Victoria stand amongst all the other great European queens? Like, in how unique is their position as British monarchs?
Very good. And?
I was interested in your very confident assertion of Elizabeth's sexual activity and would be interested to know, well, first your evidence, secondly, how she would have managed that, any sort of contraception, also managing her image in an age when everything must have been known to everybody.
Thank you. Well, we'll take some more questions in a minute. I'm going to start with the constitutional and ask Daisy, how did Victoria deal with being limited by Parliament, being told what she could and couldn't do?
She didn't like it at all.
Didn't like it at all.
No.
No.
I mean, she learnt to manage it, and she soon realised that at the beginning, the bedchamber crisis, she basically manipulates everybody to get what she wants, which is to keep Lord Melbourne in power. And she succeeds at doing that, but it makes her very unpopular. And she realises then that she's got to kind of toe the line. And when she marries Albert and she kind of figure a way of doing that. But where they become really influential is in foreign policy. So they're very, very beady about making sure that they read all the things that are sent off. And in fact, one of the most important things they do is in 1861, just before Albert dies, they manage to rewrite a letter that Lord Palmerston has sent to the Americans about to declare war because basically the Navy, the American Navy, has held up a British gunboat because there were some Southern officers on board, and they basically rewrite that letter, make it much more tactful, and stop an English-American war in 1861. So I think that's where they could influence power than they did. And Victoria, certainly in the latter part of her life, she really concentrated on foreign policy, in which she was very knowledgeable.
Philippa, how do you see Elizabeth in regard to other European queens of, let's say, the broader Middle Ages, early modern period?
Well, there are some very interesting, powerful women in Europe, and everybody always thinks of Eleanor of Aquitaine and probably Isabella of Castile. Yes. And certainly what you see then is women who clearly, in the case of Eleanor, are very, very prepared to use her sexuality because that's one of the few powers that they actually have as a woman and a reigning queen. And Isabella of Castile is a queen militant. She actually goes to war. And she manages to do it without getting the normal terrible criticism of militant women because she also organizes the Holy Inquisition. So I think what you see is in all of the powerful women, perhaps Catherine de' Medici as well, or Mary, Queen of Scots, you see women that are continually struggling with their image as women in the sense of what role is expected of them, and actually the power that they absolutely have to take and hold if they're going to rule. So it's a real struggle, particularly for women, to maintain power.
And how do you think Elizabeth got away with the level of sexual activity? If indeed there was any. You heard the
I think there is, and there's a load of instances which I could quote to you, but I know we don't have much time. I suppose one of the most telling ones is when Cat Ashley goes down on her knees to Elizabeth and she says, "Stop carrying on with Robert Dudley the way you're doing. You're going to lose the throne if you do." And Elizabeth says to her, firstly, nobody can prove that we're seeing each other at all because of the arrangements around my sleeping. And secondly, if I wanted to be his lover, I don't know of anyone who can stop me. They did have interconnecting bedroom doors. And the story that I love about Elizabeth is when people say, like, are you sure that she had a sexual relationship with him? Somebody reports in some horror her leaning out of her bedroom window, naked to the waist, calling to Robert Dudley to come up to her room at once. And I don't know about you in London, but I come from Yorkshire, and if you hung out of your bedroom window naked to the waist and called for a man, it usually means one thing.
Now we're going to take the final vote on who was the greatest monarch, Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria, and I'm going to remind you how to do that. You will have received one of these tickets on the way in. If you don't know, after all of this, whether you think Elizabeth or Victoria was the greatest, that's okay. Just put this in the box. However, if you do know and you've been persuaded by our wonderful speakers, then tear this in half and put either Queen Elizabeth or Queen Victoria in the ballot boxes, which are going to be brought around. Now we've got time for a few more questions. So there's a little girl down there. Yes, okay. First question. If we wait for the microphone, that would be
How
terrific.
do you think Elizabeth and Victoria would have got on together?
How would Elizabeth and Victoria have got on together? I'm going to take two more questions, then we're going to answer that one first. Okay, up at the back. I'm just seeing shapes now. I should have put my glasses on. Up the back, yep.
As writers of historical fiction, how do you prioritize these incredible facts about both queens that rather than submitting to the demand of crazy scandals in the media, which everyone wants for the books at the moment?
Crazy scandals. How do you keep it on the real? And the third question, just...
Do you think Queen Victoria would have been as successful as she was if she was a male?
Would she have been as successful if she was a man? That is a very good question. Okay. First things first, Daisy, how would Victoria and Elizabeth have got on?
Well, I think Victoria would not have liked Elizabeth because she was quite jealous of other queens. She got quite cross with her daughter, Vicky, when she found out that Vicky was going to be an empress and she was only a queen. And so Disraeli had to quickly make her an empress of India just to kind of keep them level. But on the other hand, she did have some very good women friends. So it's possible that she might have seen past the layers of white lead paint and seen a woman who needed a sisterhood beneath. I don't know. I mean, I hope that Victoria's powers of empathy were up to that. I doubt it, though.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. What do you think, Philippa?
I think Elizabeth would have liked her appearance because Elizabeth really liked to be, the prettiest woman in the room, even when, at whatever age. So she would have regarded the white paint as like how you should do it, and Victoria's tragically underdressed. So there would be that. I think she would have really, really snubbed her about the babies and the husband and the domestic life. I think she'd have really made her sorry about that. But apart from that, I think so therefore she might have quite liked those aspects of her. But, there's only ever one queen. I think it would have been two cats in a bag, really. I mean, tonight is a mere mild version of the things they would have said about each other.
Thank goodness we've got such polite proxies for them. Daisy, would Queen Victoria have been as successful if she were a man?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I think part of the reason that she was such a successful monarch was that she was a young woman. And you've got to remember that they'd had, 5 or 6 old men come to the throne who had mistresses, they'd had corruption scandals, they were, unattractive in every sense. And suddenly you've got this little woman who comes to the throne who's an English rose, and everybody sort of loves her because she's so different from what's come before, and they give her real benefit of the doubt. Even though she behaves quite badly in the first couple of years of her reign, people still like her, and I think the fact that she's a woman, the fact she's a matriarchy, I think actually has much bigger influence on the Victorian period than we think, because actually, although, they don't get votes for women during the 19th century, the fact that you have a woman as head of state makes an enormous difference to the way that women and men think about themselves at that time. And I think that was and the fact that she's having babies and she's still a monarch, okay? Remember that. She's having 9 children. She's still the queen, shows that you can, do your job and be a mother.
I want to bring in, if you're happy, Fiona and Greta now, and ask, in your experience of playing royalty, even if just tonight, is there anything particularly that you feel as an actor when you're channeling the words of these queens? What does it take to play a royal? What do you think, Fiona?
Well, I think in plays, usually the person is under great pressure. That's what's interesting about them. And just with someone like Elizabeth, I mean, I've never played Elizabeth, but in the Elizabethan period, she sort of oversaw, I think it's what you said, a flourishing of intellectual and literary and poetic life that had never been in the medieval Britain before. And I think probably slightly disappeared in the 19th century. The values had shifted. But all actors want to play queens.
Is that true? Greta, all actors want to play queens?
Yes, I did have a go at playing Elizabeth in Mary Stuart in a production in Sydney. And it was a fabulous role to play because I could behave really badly, and I thought she was a terrible woman. She was vain and capricious, and she just wanted to have everything her way. She was terribly spoilt and couldn't control her temper at all, and was also blamed others, and it never took responsibility for anything, really. And that's in the Schiller play. Of course, you might judge that this might have some reflection on Victoria. This is the first chance I've had to play Victoria. And yes, I think, as Fiona was saying, it's very interesting to play. Anytime you play a role, you're imagining putting yourself in other people's shoes with a whole different background to your own. And of course, it's a great exercise to imagine being in a place where you have that amount of pressure on you.
So you just reminded me, I did play Mary Stuart in that play, but all they are is us, but excessively so. So anything that we have is completely just bellowed up if you play a queen, and the consequences of their actions. So when they breathe, it does has a huge effect on everybody else, doesn't it?
Yes, and I'm certainly not a monarchist, but I do, having acted these sort of roles, found myself always really thinking, when we talk about the monarchy and whether we want to get rid of it or not, remembering that these are people who have been stuck in these positions, and it's not easy for them.
well, I wish we could continue this all night, but we are getting towards 8:30, which is when I'm going to be dragged off the stage, even if you'll get to stay here. So I'm going to ask both of our wonderful speakers to make their closing statements. So we're returning really to the question of what is your one clinching argument. And I'm going to ask Daisy to make your statement first.
Well, I suppose I think that you can be a powerful woman and you can exercise power and you can also get married, you can have children, and you can, in the words of, Helen Gurley Brown or whoever it was, you can have it all. And I think that you don't have to make choices. You can be a powerful woman without denying any part of your femininity.
Wonderful. Philippa.
And I don't think you could in the medieval period. And when you're judging Elizabeth, you have to judge her as a medieval woman and a medieval queen. As a medieval queen, she was tremendous. She oversaw a golden age, an age of expansion, an age in which, in a sense, England defined itself in terms of its nationality. And as a woman, she lived, I think, the richest, fullest life she possibly could in the circumstances, and certainly better than the wives of her lovers.
Well, thank you very much to both our speakers. I am now going to announce the results of the vote. Now, before the debate, if you remember, it was 53% to Queen Elizabeth I, 24% to Queen Victoria, and 23% of you were undecided. Now, after the debate, I can reveal that 2% of you are still undecided. 51% of you think Queen Elizabeth I was the greatest, and 47% believe that Queen Victoria. So we've had quite a swing there to Queen Victoria. If only they could really get together. Actually, maybe that's not a bad idea. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think on behalf of all of us here, I think we should congratulate Daisy Goodwin, Philippa Gregory, Greta Scacchi even. Jesus. I'm going to get this right. Fiona Shaw. Thank you very much to all our speakers. I'd also like to say thank you very much indeed to Intelligence Squared for putting on this wonderful occasion. I have to tell you that both Daisy and Philippa will be signing books in the foyer. Please stop, buy a book, have a chat, get the book signed. And thank you finally to all of you for coming tonight. Thank you.